Hey, this is Shane Smith from Shane Smith Law, and we are on another episode of Mind Matters, where we discuss brain injuries, concussions, and everything head injury related. Got here today with us Thomas Ozbolt, one of the attorneys at Shane Smith Law, who heads up our concussion and brain injury group. Thomas, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Shane. How about you?
I'm doing good. So what's the main topic for today?
Just wanted to talk a little bit about the impact of mild traumatic brain injuries on essentially the healthcare system, on the American public.
I guess in the awareness of recent years, I think it's a bigger impact than everybody thought. That we initially thought maybe severe car accidents and maybe boxers, but now we find out it's all across sports, many more car accidents than people think. And that I think years ago, they thought you have a concussion, you just get better. But we're finding out more and more that that's not the case, that it does lasting harm, right?
Absolutely. One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting in doing some research on this, and particularly sobering really, is the mortality from head injuries in the last 12 years has exceeded the cumulative number of Americans killed in all wars since the founding of our country. Statistics that were compiled back in 2009. So that's not even bringing in the last 15 years when we've seen, population growth, more cars on the road, presumably with cheaper materials as car companies try to minimize their costs instead of using stainless steel. I'm pulling these numbers for most experts in this field in terms of biomechanics of whiplash and mild traumatic brain injuries. It's from Arthur C. Croft, and pulling from his data, which is compiled.
Yeah, and I know Dr. Croft, he's done a ton of work on head injuries and whiplash. I would assume across the board, but still it shows the prevalence of it. It shows how bad it is, basically. And it's one of those things that you don't hear a lot of people talk about unless you've got a family member or coworker who died because of it. You're not thinking about head injuries that much, would go, I guess.
Yeah, and people don't really want to talk about these things a lot of times. Is you just might see people changing their patterns and behavior in life and changing, how long they might stay out at night or stay out with their friends or just do different activities. And you just might never know from looking at someone face to face that they're suffering from a traumatic brain injury. The non-fatal conservative estimate of head injuries is 2 million a year. Again, this is from 2009. It has an overall economic impact in terms of the economic cost on society of what's estimated to be $25 billion a year.
Well, that's crazy.
45, and that's with 1.5 million patients who are treated outside of the hospital setting. So a lot of these numbers are coming from hospitals. And as we know, hospitals are somewhat notorious at missing brain injury diagnoses from what our CDC tells us.
We've talked about it multiple times on the podcast that the emergency room misses a lot of brain injuries that unless you come in with just blaring symptoms, they just skip right over it and not even address it or not put it in your medical records. Then you don't even notice until a couple days later when, that crushing migraine comes on or you pass out or whatever the other symptoms are.
Absolutely. And these numbers we're talking about, this 1.5 to 2 million, those are what you've talked about is those ones that are pretty obvious, the more severe injuries. Those are ones where someone's actually got their skull fractured and caved in a little bit, where it's going to show up on this very broad and general imaging. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in 1989, they estimated the annual number of brain injuries at 7 million. There's some pretty different numbers there, just from different sources and people who are looking at this and different methodologies.
And I think that brings an issue up is, how do we classify them? It would be great if everybody would get on the same page and classify them the same way.
Yeah, and I think what's happened in recent years is there's been more scientific studies and, you don't ever want to say consensus when you're talking about science, but, more people coming together and starting to agree upon the methodology for classifying.
During the break, we were talking a little bit about, two photographs that basically sort of illustrate some of this emerging consensus, I guess. Tell me about the first one.
The first one talked about the economic impacts of mild traumatic brain injury and mortality from the head injuries, kind of the economic cost that this has on society in terms of taking people out of work or, having to have healthcare costs diverted towards that. The next one talked a little bit more, we talked about this a little bit, was about the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration statistics on the annual number of brain injuries back in 1989, and that was at 7 million. So that was at an incidence of 2,456 out of every 100,000. So that would be one injury for every 40 citizens per year.
I mean, crazy high. Looking into the concussion stuff and talking to you and John, and seeing the stuff, like even your headrest in your car is supposed to be positioned a certain spot to minimize whiplash and head injuries. I mean, that's the point. And so many of us never adjust it, but that's designed to increase safety, and none of us do anything about it, right?
If you thought about it in terms of if you have a child seat in your car, your kid in the baby carrier or in the child seat, it's like we should almost be looking at it with the same sort of vigilance. You want to make sure your kid's appropriately tightened in the seat, everything is right. Like we should be doing that same thing with one of the main devices that protects this egg we're carrying around.
I've seen it progress over time. I mean, since I was growing up, when I was a kid, you didn't wear bicycle helmets at all. None of us did. I guess the street racing dudes had bicycle helmets, the ones with the little 10-speed street bike that goes so fast, but everybody else didn't. And I can remember, being a kid, jumping a ramp and all kind of stuff, and none of us ever wore a helmet. And I remember like when my mom was trying to encourage us to, at some point, we're just like, whatever, Mom, we can't do that. Nobody wears those. Now it's common, but so we've seen a progression, but I mean, those numbers are still horrible.
It's tremendous. It's, they call it a silent epidemic. You look at admissions to a hospital for brain trauma. Back on the writing of this book in 2009, there were 400,000 admissions to hospital each year for brain trauma. Of those 400,000, 80 to 90% of those were classified as mild. So those are ones where you don't have, impaction on the skull, where the skull's being stoved in or caved in to any extent, or there's not like a visible injury. 80 to 90% of 400,000.
And I would say, the idea that the National Traffic Highway Safety folks say it's much, much higher, but even the ones that go to the hospital, that's bad enough that the hospital sees it and diagnoses it, what'd you say, like 10, 20% have the skull fracture or the indent in the skull. And that's the part that all of us think about for the most part is, oh, you got to be fine. You hit your head. I would say I'm the same way. If there's no blood, there's no indent in the skull, the assumption is you're okay. You're good to go, which as we find out is not at all the case.
And we've got a way of educating adjusters and educating juries and, explaining just to the general public, hey, these are events of tremendous consequence and significance in people's lives. A tremendous amount of claims that are going on in car crashes these days, you're what you call this silent epidemic or this invisible injury, something not going to show up in a lot of scans.
What are the main symptoms, like somebody would know, that I could identify, or like as a passenger, I see my driver, we just get into, we'll say a rear end collision, or we bump into, we hit somebody in the front. What are the symptoms if I'm looking at my driver saying, hey, this is something I need to make sure the EMT knows, or when we go to the hospital, I need to say, pay attention to this. Don't just pay attention to his back and neck that hurts. Really check them out because I'm worried about this. What are some symptoms we would tell regular people to look out for?
One of the first ones that people don't recognize or identify would be an alteration or loss of consciousness. And when I say loss of consciousness, not so much getting knocked out, waking up, feeling like you blacked out. It's having a lack of memory of even just a few seconds before the crash, because people won't identify that as they think about it and talk about it as a loss of consciousness. But that's really what it is. It's if you don't have that memory, your consciousness has been altered. And if that's been altered, that's the same as a loss of consciousness.
So that's the big one. So anytime somebody says, I don't know what happened, or how do we get here, or what happened? I mean, what happened seems like the main thing, right? Like, if they're the driver and they're like, that's it. It doesn't have to be a long loss of consciousness then. It could be just a couple seconds.
Yeah, it can be any period of time where there's just no memory of that. That's what would be a loss of consciousness. It doesn't have to be an event where they remember things going black and then they remember waking up. It's, any alteration of consciousness is considered a loss of consciousness. And that's one of the biggest indicators. Then of course, if you hit your head, hey, that might be an obvious one, but you don't have to hit your head. You can have just that rapid acceleration or deceleration force causing your brain to push up against your skull. That can be one of them. And then obviously headaches, or if there's some sort of what we would call just the brain fog, just feeling like you're in a daze. That's a change of consciousness, an alteration of consciousness. That's almost as significant as a loss of consciousness.
anytime really, if I'm talking to somebody who's been in a wreck and they're like, I don't remember what happened, that ought to be at least a trigger warning or trigger that we need to dig into it a little bit more. Or if afterwards they're like, hey, I feel like I'm walking around in a daze. That's also one of those key words where like, okay, let's check you out kind of deal. And, I know I used to, when I would talk to clients and they'd be like, I don't think I hit my head. No. And I'd be like, okay, well, one, feel your head. Right. But two, did you bust any window or any windows in your car busted? Because if there are, something hit it hard enough to break it, But the feel your head was always silly because I'd be on a call with the client. They'd be like, well, hold on. And then I'm like, holy cow, I do have this huge knot on the right side or on the back or something else. And then suddenly we're like, okay, tell your doctor this. Let's dig into this and make sure you really are okay.
It's important for us to do that because you have a lot of medical professionals who just may not be up to date on the types of things that are associated with traumatic brain injuries in this day and age that we're in now. It's very different than it was 20 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's us being able to triage and help our clients get the help that they need. It's asking and digging in deeper, because a lot of times they might not even think to say, I don't remember what happened. They just think that's normal. They just think it happened so fast.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the common thing, right? It happened so fast, I don't know what happened. Well, maybe that's what happened. Or maybe you hit your head and you don't know what's going on. Let's get you checked out and make sure you are. In fact, it just happened super quick. I think about rollovers. I mean, when I was a kid, I was in a rollover and we sort of remember what happened, but then there are parts of that where, you look back and you're like, do I really remember it all or do I not? Because I remember, being upside down. I remember like one roll, but I don't remember much more beyond that. So, thinking back, it's like, okay, what really happened there? And I know that happens all the time. When you see the big SUV with the airbag poofed and all that, I mean, that deceleration force you were talking about is huge on those airbags. I mean, in no way am I saying airbags are bad. I'm saying, though, we notice it more, than we used to, I think, because of airbags. But like I say, I think they're a safety feature that's definitely worth the risk of that.
Yeah, maybe we have less moderate to severe head injuries from hitting on the wheel, but those are turning up more as mild.
Well, that's true too. Yeah, they're more mild than they used to be because they're not hitting the windshield or the steering wheel or whatever. So, okay. And yeah, when you talk about the economic consequences, to me, before I got into all this, I thought sort of the economic consequence was, your medical bills and the economic consequence to that person, but also all the loss of productivity. They can't work. If they're really have a severe injury, somebody else has to take care of them. So that person's sort of sucked out of doing other work as well. So it can be devastating to the entire family, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you look at just, like you said, the lack of productivity, the inability to work, missing time for doctor's appointments and getting therapy, that just, it puts a tremendous strain, not only on the family, but on society, or not only on society, but on the family. It's like silent epidemic, but this invisible epidemic that you think of, almost like a diabetes. It's like, think about how much productivity something like that takes out of society with the way it can sap people's energy and just take you out, and lots of medications, lots of appointments. And it's I think another one of those things that'd be interesting to look at that and compare that sometime in a future episode.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you talk about appointments and all that, I mean, and our listeners know, if you've read my newsletter, like I broke my ankle. And just the doctor's appointments I've had to have related to that, in the grand scheme of things, it's not even a severe break, right? It's not non-displaced, so it's right in the area, so I'm not needing surgery or anything, but get an MRI, go see the doctor here, go see the doctor again after the MRI, go give a follow-up in 3 weeks, go to PT, all of those things. And that's a very limited injury that's well known. Doc, we know how to treat this, quote, not a big deal. When you compare that to a head injury that impacts so many other areas, and in prior episodes, we talked about how it impacts your hormones and it impacts your whole body. And so they're seeing not just a quote head injury doc, right? They're not going to see just a neurologist. They got to see multiple doctors dealing with the same injury, right?
Yeah, you're thinking about maybe ear, nose, and throat for vestibular issues. You're thinking about neurooptometrists. Can even interfere with the endocrine system. Your neuroendocrinology, like that system that affects balance, potentially sexual dysfunction, just different things like that. There's so many things that stem from the brain. It's the command center for our entire body. So we're just scratching the surface really on seeing what types of impacts a brain injury can have on a person.
Have you seen any statistics where they break down, okay, the number of people who have a brain injury who it impacts their ability to drive or whether they can or cannot drive? Have we seen that hard and fast statistics? Because I know obviously it doesn't happen to everybody, but those it does happen to, that's a devastating impact. You know, they take away your driver's license when the doctor do, and then you have to have somebody else drive you around to all these appointments you're going to. So I haven't seen that statistic. I wanted to see if you've come across it.
To keep doing some digging, you see it in terms of just the different symptomology, people having issues with dizziness or vertigo, and it's a complex thing in terms of tying that to the injury versus what other factors may be contributing to that condition. And a lot of times you don't get the ability to tie vertigo or dizziness to the brain injury unless you have something like a legal case where you need to prove it. Otherwise, it's just, hey, doctors aren't going to go down this long and winding road of saying, hey, this is what caused it. It's just, hey, this is what you have and how it happened. We don't care. We just want to,
we just want to fix you, right? Or get it under control. I mean, that makes a lot of sense from a non-legal point of view, right? Now, obviously, you and I, on the personal injury side, if a car accident causes it or a slip and fall or some other accident causes it, we need to know and be able to prove it. Same in workers' comp as well. But yeah, I could see a doc saying, look, it doesn't really matter to me why you got hurt. I just got to fix you.
And I mean, maybe that gets to some of the core of some issues with, the American medical system, where it's like, hey, let's not look at the root. Let's look at all the branches, and we'll prune the branches. We won't get to the root cause of what's going on because, maybe we can't bill for it as much, or maybe I can't prescribe all these medications for it.
Yeah.
Definitely interesting questions that arise out of that.
I think honestly, though, if we took 10 experts in this brain injury area and said, hey, what's the best way to dig into this? We'd probably get 10 different answers because it's so new. We talked to a doc, I think last week, and he's like, yeah, I went into Atlanta and I didn't find anybody doing these kind of testing. And I'm like, that seems crazy to me because there's an orthopedist. It seems like every 50 feet, every mile I can find an orthopedist. In a city the size of Atlanta, nobody else is doing what you're doing. He goes, no, we're actually getting referrals from hospitals and stuff. I'm like, that's crazy. In today's world, there's like one dude doing this. The fact that medically we're not doing more is disheartening, I guess.
No, I agree with you there. It's 87% of the counties in America don't have a neurologist in them. So it's 13. If you look at it like that, only 13% of the counties in America have a practicing neurologist.
And my guess is if you take those 13%, I mean, all of them are metro areas. So, and if you look at a map, there's a lot of our country that's not in a metro area, and those folks just have no access, or they got to drive an hour and a half to 2 hours. And if they get a severe head injury, like we talked about, it's not even just them doing it, it's, their caregiver as well. So it's definitely a huge issue. Now, I know we've talked in prior episodes, they're getting some more telemedicine is opening the area up. Telemedicine is great, but there's only so many tests you can do behind a Zoom screen versus in person, I think, right?
Yeah, and that is a really good point on telemedicine, because what it's doing is it's expanding access to care for people who would otherwise never have any answers. And we see a lot of pushback from insurance companies who don't like that access to care being there, because it's showing a lot more injuries than would have otherwise been diagnosed, because there would have been no access to those neurologists. But it is a fantastic resource.
Yeah, I would say, even if it's not perfect, it's certainly a whole lot better than nothing, which is what a lot of our clients, in these rural areas were experiencing. Nothing, nobody they could talk to. Even I know sometimes even just talking to somebody who says, yes, you have a head injury, this is what's causing this behavior. That alone is worth a ton of money to some of our clients, just knowing they're not crazy or quote crazy.
It's, just confirming and letting them know that something's wrong and that's okay, and that we're going to find some answers for it. And that's one of the things I think we do well here at Shane Smith Law, is help people find answers for their issues and help them get diagnosed and treated. Proud to be a part of that.
I would agree. I think that's one of our big things, is we want to help you at least find out what's wrong and go from there, right? We don't want to just cover up or skip it out. We want to know what the issue is and at least give you some answers along those lines. Thomas, I think want to thank you for coming on the podcast today. This is Mind Matters, where we discuss brain injuries, concussions, and everything head injury related. If you like this kind of information and find it helpful, hit like and subscribe so you see our future episodes. Otherwise, I'll talk to you soon. And this is Shane from Shane Smith Law.
In pain, so I call Shane. 980-999-9999. In pain, call Shane.